Nigeria's threshold for violence is incredibly high and appears to be rising exponentially. Not only has the spread of violence metastasized in size and geographical spread, it has assumed a normalcy that is chilling and does not appear will abate anytime soon. While the mass atrocities casualties tracking is a look in the rearview mirror, it is instructive in the data that it provides and the narrative it paints of Nigeria's chronic insecurity and what needs to be done. The loss of more than 3,000 persons to mass atrocities, not including armed robbery and other forms of isolated violence in any country in a single year, is an indication that all is not well and in need of a declaration of the same. The nature and geographical spread of the violence is also quite instructive. The highlights of the report include: 1, that the most prevalent forms of atrocities included cult gang clashes, extrajudicial killings, resource crisis, kidnappings, and Boko Haram ISWAP attacks. The states with the highest number of fatalities remained Borno State in the northeast, closely followed by Zamfara State in the northwest. Based on available data, the 10 most vulnerable states in Nigeria by the list number of deaths recorded in each were Borno with 728 deaths, Zamfara with at least 450, Kaduna with at least 280, Katsina with at least 254, Taraba with at least 181, Rivers with at least 176, Benue with at least 167, Niger with at least 100, Sokoto with at least 90, and Kogi State with at least 88. The least affected state in the entire federation was Abia State with 1 killing. Another very hard fact that this report reveals that 1 in 5.5 persons who were killed in the course of the year were state security personnel, and this is highly alarming. Our enumerators recorded at least 481 of them, most of them soldiers in active service. This points to the fact that our security personnel have become an endangered species. As the report rightly points out, for every security personnel downed in the course of active service, their arms fall in the hands of wrong elements who will use them to foment further insecurity. Of particular tragedy was the extrajudicial killing of officers of the Nigerian Army of 3 police officers in Taraba State on a covert mission to arrest a notorious kidnapper in August of 2019. Violence-related deaths were also recorded in every state, with Abia notably the least impacted with 1 death. Borno, like I said, at least 728. The North and the Middle Belt region recorded the highest number of casualties, while Rivers State recorded the highest number in the South, with at least 176 deaths, largely due to cult gang clashes. Every month of the year recorded casualties above 100, from the types of violence mentioned earlier. June had the highest number of deaths last year with 504, while November was the lightest with 112 deaths. For the month of June, we noted the correlation between the federal government's announcement of the Ruga settlement programs and the sudden upsurge of violence in Benue State that had hitherto assumed relative quiet, especially with the deployment of Operation Whirlstroke in the Benue Valley. However, on a positive note for Benue State, we note that the Giaku killings and the clash which occurred between herders and farmers in Agatu were the only incidents of mass violence on record for the period, which suggests that the federal military operations in Benue was relatively effective in suppressing killings. Kidnappings in 2019 also became of a more commercial nature. Victims were targeted or randomly kidnapped in both urban and rural settings and on highways. The infamous Kaduna-Abuja highway constituted a hotspot for abductions in spite of several security checkpoints along the length of the road. The Northwest also suffered from this phenomenon for more than a year, particularly in Katsina and Zamfara State. There are also elements of political kidnappings earlier in the year around election seasons across the country. In November, there were at least 112 deaths, some of which were related to electoral violence occasioned in the run-up to and during and after the Kogi and Bayelsa elections. You will also recall that there were a number of election-related deaths from November 2018 up to April 2019, covering the course of the election. Now, how did we come about these numbers, and what methods did we use? Nigeria's atrocities are very nebulous, and so without baselines from which to draw inferences from in terms of human assets and the violence markers, it's difficult to ascribe certainty to numbers and intensities. So for this report, we have only included killings verified by at least 2 or more sources. We are aware of the general tendencies to underreport military casualties in the theater of operation, particularly in the northeast of the country. We recognize that actual figures of the uniform casualties are likely to be significantly higher. Our methodology errs on the side of the conservative, pointing only to verifiable incidents and locations. The figures therefore provided represents the list of possible numbers of casualties. Actual casualty figures are likely to be much higher, but we're confident that the trends evident from these figures will hold up to scrutiny. Our conclusion. The numbers for 2019 were slightly lower compared to the numbers for 2018, in which period we had recorded 3,428 deaths, which means in 2019 we recorded 240 deaths less. Disaggregated, in 2019 there were at least 481 security personnel that were killed, and at least 2,707 civilians. It's instructive, again, we emphasize that nearly 1 in every 6 persons killed in mass atrocities in Nigeria was a state security personnel, and this is an alarming trend. Equally alarming is the implication that their service weapons were taken away by their assailants. There's a rise in kidnappings across Nigeria, which suggests that ransoms have become a major source of funding for both the insurgency in the northeast of the country and for banditry in the northwest. Additionally, the patterns of attack on security personnel and its formation is consistent with the conclusion that the attackers rearm themselves with weapons stolen from overrunning security posts or killing security personnel. We only began to document kidnappings in August when it became apparent that this has become a staple crime and now qualifies as a mass atrocity for Nigeria. But because we started to record in August, we do not have an aggregate for the number of reported kidnappings for Nigeria for 2019. As in previous years, we were unable to track the numbers for number of persons grievously wounded from these atrocities, people who became disabled, the number of persons who were displaced, persons who suffered sexual violence in the course of these atrocities, the cost of properties lost as a result of these atrocities. And because of the tendency to report only aggregated numbers, we were also unable to disaggregate based on gender or age. From the foregoing figures, it's apparent Nigeria's threshold for violence is high, and its hardcore impact on security and well-being of both citizens and security populations can only be imagined. It brings to mind Section 14(2)(b) of the Constitution, which provides that the security and welfare of the people shall be the primary purpose of government. The challenge in mitigating violence in Nigeria and the protection of its people clearly falls on government and its agencies. It therefore follows that the country's security architecture is in need of an urgent overhaul. And by security architecture, we refer not just to security agencies and hardware, but the entire governance structure and institutions charged with dealing with the triggers that perpetuate these forms of violence, which are multidimensional. While there are myriads of triggers to talk about, we will only mention a few. First, arms and light weapons. The proliferation of arms and light weapons across Nigeria is worrisome, and directly related to that, elections are getting more violent. Politics in Nigeria is still a game of win at all costs or lose at your peril. No retreat, no surrender. Incentivizing violence. This is evident in the 2019 general elections, in which security agents freely took sides in the violence. In the Kogi and Bayelsa elections at the end of the run-up elections at the end of the year, small arms and light weapons were freely deployed. Revisiting incentives for public office and citizens' participation in governance is therefore imperative. Communities' distrust for government's willingness, and more recently, power to protect them from aggression, has also contributed to Nigeria's underground arms market. Finally, its porous borders facilitate their easy import. The number of out-of-school children in Nigeria. Nigeria has the highest number of out-of-school children in the entire planet, a pointer for unskilled human resources and a future for low productivity and unemployment. These are drivers for poverty and crime. Impunity. While corruption is rife in Nigeria, its greatest problem is impunity. There's been very little accountability for the various crimes perpetuated against individuals and communities in the past. The misapplied quest for justice often results in self-help reprisal attacks, which morph and snowball into bigger crimes and conflicts. Poverty. Endemic poverty drives violence. The World Bank statistics recently released shows that 87% of the most chronically poor people in Nigeria live in northern Nigeria, and it is no surprise that the highest number of the killings, therefore, were also in northern Nigeria. When people have nothing to lose, they help everyone else lose everything. The failure to provide social welfare and palliatives for suffering communities continue to be drivers for crimes and conflicts across Nigeria. Resource governance. Nigeria's poor governance of its natural and material resources trigger violence. And by natural resources, we mean not just minerals, but also land and potable water bodies. Poorly maintained capital infrastructure, lack of fiscal justice, and lack of judicious disbursement of state and national assets have also led to citizens' frustration. Finally, can Nigeria surmount its challenges and become a safe haven for development? We believe so. But we also know that it will take a great deal of political will, trust building across ethnic, religious, class, and other interest groups, active trust building. It will also take addressing actively, and not just by word of mouth, historical violence and injustices throughout Nigeria, and making clear attempts at remedying them. God bless Nigeria.